The reason it didn't win wasn't because the Armenians didn't try. It was because the British were too foolish to take advantage of the offer that the Armenians had made. Just another quick look at the rail lines that go through there. The reason you don't see a whole lot more roads there is because those are high mountains. Those are high mountains in that territory, and it's very difficult for anybody to get through other than on these main roads, which again have been there forever. Next, and in many ways a favorite of mine because I've been studying Van for many years, the province of Van. Van is a province that had a fairly high Armenian population, up to about a third. The population was overwhelmingly Muslim, obviously, but nevertheless, there were a lot of Armenians in this territory, and there were a lot of revolts. It is perhaps the best example of Armenians acting along with the Russians. I'm not sure that you can see the crosshatches on the map, but if you could see the crosshatches on the map, you would see that all of the areas that are noted there are places where Armenians revolted against the Ottomans. The people that are doing the revolting are what's called the Dashnak Party, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, which still exists today, actually. At the beginning of the war, the Armenians had already begun their revolts. 2 months before the war began, they began the revolts in the southern part. I'll show you. Down here in Shatak, and over here in Bashkal, here, in these areas, they had begun their revolts before the war even began. As the war began, the revolt spread to the other areas that you see there. There was slaughter of Muslim villages as one of the most essential parts of the revolt. Actually, tens of thousands of copies of what were called, well, the rules for defense, basically. They were set out by the Armenians to villages all over Van. They weren't really rules for defense, they were rules for attack. They were rules for what you do when the Ottomans go to war with the Russians. And they set up how the cadres would be founded, who would have the weapons, what you would do if your village had a lot of Muslims in it, what you would do if you were an Armenian village that was spread out and wasn't there, it was among the Muslims, where you would move to, how you would occupy defensive posts. In other words, a blueprint for revolt that had been set out 4 years before the war began. The chance came at the end of 1914 and the beginning of 1915. The Russians, as I say, were in Iran and in the north as well. The question was, where could the Ottomans most be hurt? Where could the Armenians do the most damage? And that was in the passes. You can see the passes over here. The Sarai Pass up here, the Kotur Pass, and the Bashkali Dur Pass down there. The reason that those were so damaging, so potentially damaging to the Ottomans, was that the Ottomans had a much more limited amount of troops than the Russians did. The Ottomans had a very difficult time defending the area, but they had some advantages. One of the advantages was that they held these passes. And what the military calls a force multiplier was in effect. The force multiplier indicated that, if you're in a pass and you control it, you can have 4 or 5 times as many people coming to get you, and you can still hold it. The other advantage they have was internal communications. The Russians were spread out along the outside, the Ottomans on the inside of a circle. So the Ottomans should have been able to communicate back and forth more effectively. Unfortunately, as we've already seen, and as we'll see more of in a minute, the Armenians cutting the telegraph lines completely obviated this benefit. The other thing they did was they ruined the benefits of the passes. Right? The main mountain passes that were the key to the defense of the southeast. As you can see, I hope, if you can see this from back where you're sitting, these are very high mountainous passes. What we're talking about when we talk about going from Iran into Anatolia, or what today is Turkey is, we're talking about a very few places where a large number of men can possibly get through. One of the main ones of these is the Dir Dolman Pass, as you can see. Another one, the Kotur Pass. I hope you can get a feeling from this as to what we're talking about. Once again, even more than the passes we saw at Sivas, you're talking about mountainous areas that are surrounding roads that go through the middle. Now, if you hold these mountainous areas and if you hold the road, you're in good shape. But you're only in good shape if you hold the road and the area to the other side of the road. If you hold the road against an enemy coming this way, you're in fine shape. But if the enemy manages not only to come at you this way, but to come at you from behind, then you're surrounded. And in many times, you're dead. And in many places, that's exactly what happened, because when the Van Rebellion took place, the Armenian rebels centered their rebellion around the pass area. As you can see, I hope you can see from the yellow, where the Kotor Pass, the Sarai Pass, the Bashkali Pass, where those things were, was exactly where the Armenians revolted. And it was a very strange revolt in many ways, because, for instance, in the Sarai area, I won't go back, because I don't think I can go back. There's telling me to do it, but I don't know what it is. In the Sarai area, for instance, in one of those passes, the more northern of the passes that I showed you, in that area, the Ottoman forces were surrounded by Armenians. The Ottomans found so many Armenians against them that the forces that were holding the pass were defeated by the Armenians, that the Armenians killed more than 400 Ottoman soldiers. Now, many times it's been said that, well, these people were only defending themselves. Well, if they were only defending themselves, why in the world were they attacking Ottoman military units, especially in a place like Sarai, where only 5% of the population was Armenian? The people who attacked the soldiers in those passes were not locals. They came from all over the Van province. They came, some of them, from as far away as Russia, and many from Iran. They organized into military units, defeated the Ottomans at the passes, and ultimately allowed the Russians to come through. In some areas, like the southern area of Bashkali and Vir that I showed you before, in those areas, the local Armenians took over the cities and held them for the Russians, and indeed, when the Russians felt that they couldn't hold on for a while, the Russians retreated. Many of the Armenians stayed and fought the Ottomans themselves. In this case, they were defeated. In many areas, like the areas to the south of Lake Van, in many areas like the far southern area of Chatak that I told you about before, Ottoman forces found it very, very difficult to carry on any kind of communication. They found it very difficult to supply. In fact, at one point, one Ottoman unit of 2 battalions of soldiers found that they could not move 20 miles in a week, because they had to fight their way all the way up the roads against Armenians. These were people who, as a group, were in revolt against their own government. But the worst of all for the Ottomans was the city that I precipitously drew up here, and that is the city of Van. The city of Van is the primary city of southeastern Turkey today, and was the primary city of southeastern Anatolia back then. One of the oldest cities in the world, actually. In the city of Van, the Turks were spared for a while from revolution until everything was prepared properly by the Armenian revolutionaries. And on April 20th of 1915, they revolted in the city. They took over the area that you see in red, which is the Armenian fort, held it against the Ottoman forces. And in the, you see, Kali district, sometimes called the Old City of Van, in that area, as you can see in blue, the Armenians started out in that area, moved out, and took the entire area of the city, forcing the Ottoman soldiers, the troops that were guarding it, to go up into the citadel. There were at the time about 2,000 Ottoman soldiers, and they could not hold out against the Armenians. Ultimately, 6,000 trained Ottoman soldiers, many of them regulars, and they could not hold out against the Armenians. I estimate there were maybe up to 30,000 Armenian soldiers' forces in that place, but there surely were one heck of a lot to defeat that many Turks. The worst of all then, the worst came in May 16th to 17th. Because when the Armenians had taken much of the area of the city, they had forced the Muslims to leave. The Muslims had fled, but what they had done was primarily the destruction of property. For instance, in the old city, all those buildings you see down there in green that were the Ottoman government buildings were all burned to the ground. This was not a particularly rational act, since they hoped to have them for themselves, but they did. When the Ottomans had to leave, in 15th and 16th of May, when the Ottomans had to retreat because the Armenians were defeating them, and especially because the Russians were coming to the south, the Armenians then began to kill every single man, woman, and child who was left in the city, except for a small number, it's hard to, perhaps 30, perhaps 100, women and some children. who survived, mainly because they were in the American missionary quarters. Once the Armenians and the Russians took over this area, they began to attack and oppress every single Muslim village in Van. They began to go on the roads